State Treasurer John Schroder here for a little bit. Hey, Mr. John, welcome back to Keel. Good morning. How are you today, sir?
John, you are the.
Hello, John. Can you hear us okay?
Is he there? You there, Mr. John?
Hello.
Hey, there you are.
Good.
Okay.
Okay.
I got to ask you.
Technology.
Yeah, it's crazy stuff. You're in charge of the State Bond Commission. And I want you to walk us through the process of our city is in the process of putting a bond election on the ballot in November. How soon does that have to be before the State Bond Commission? What's the process for doing this?
Well, let's be clear. I chair the bond commission. I'm not in charge of it because those are all, you got the governor, you got the attorney general, you got the secretary of state, Speaker of the House, President of the Senate, and then the money committee. So I chair it. I'm certainly not in charge of it. I wish I was. We'd spend less money. So what happens is in Louisiana, if you borrow money in your political subdivision, you have to go to the bond commission to get approval. Now, in some cases, it goes on the ballot. In other cases, it doesn't. And I don't recall off the top of my head which proposition you're talking about, but generally they get approved by the bond commission. Some go on a ballot, some do not.
The mayor of Shreveport, Adrian Perkins, has city council is looking at it now. It's a proposed $220 million bond issue.
And it would go on the ballot, by the way.
And the city council is going to take a look at it next week. If they pass it by a majority, the mayor wants to have it on the ballot by November. What happens between if it's passed by the city council, if they go, yeah, we are going to give that a thumb up? What are the steps that happen between that and November? And is there anything between the city council's approval and the November ballot that could screw it up?
No, typically what happens is they get approval from the bond commission. And look, the bond commission typically isn't looking at the whether it's a good tax, bad tax, or whatever. They're just looking at the finances, whether a city or a municipality, really it's a political subdivision because it could be public hospitals, school boards, whatever, sheriff's offices. Whether they're looking at their finances, whether their finances are in check.
So pardon me. So you guys are just basically the credit bureau that says, yeah, you guys can afford this or can't, and are all your I's dotted and T's crossed?
That's correct, Robert. Can you pay it back? And that's all we're really looking at now. I will tell you, there have been some situations where, if you remember back in last year, early this year, they had one in Monroe with the Economic Development District that the council didn't approve, and I kicked it back, asking them to go get approval from the council, from the city council. And typically what happens is, to the bond commission, you have to have approval from all these. You have to have a resolution in support from the council, or we typically will not pass it.
Excuse me, Mr. John. So how will the bond commission, or anybody for that matter, how do you run a credit check on a city? And is Shreveport like a 750 or a 250?
Yeah. So what happens is, and this, I don't want to get overcomplicated. So when these municipalities or these political subdivisions apply, they're going either out on the open market and selling their bonds, or they're going, typically what happens, Robert, they go to one of your local banks. And the banks go through that process just like they would for you, for your business, or any other entity. So they go through the same process that any business does. Although I got to tell you, some towns have still gotten in trouble, even being approved by the bank and going through the financial test that you typically would go through, and they still get in trouble and can't pay their bills. And that's been That's been a growing problem in Louisiana.
Let me ask you this: the millage that this is going to be replacing is to roll off at the end of this year, and so the administration with our city is calling this a renewal. That instead of letting this millage roll off, we're asking voters to approve to continue it. Is that a technicality to say this is a renewal or this is an increase in taxes? Help me with that, because I struggle with that.
So, Aaron, there's a lot of difference of opinions. You know, John Bell Edwards, our current governor, would tell you that he lowered taxes, although we have the second to highest sales tax in the United States of America. I would tell you that we raised taxes. I believe these villages expire. I believe that the 27-month tax put in place 3 years ago expired, and that they had to pass another tax of 0.45 and raise your taxes. I would tell you that a millage expires for a reason. It has to go back to the ballot to be voted on by the citizens of that parish or city, and that is a new tax. That's how I see it.
Okay, one more thing real quick, and this may be getting off into the weeds for you. Our city was downgraded by Moody's to, I believe, to an A3. Is that a city that shouldn't be borrowing this much money?
That's a city that ought to be looking at their borrowing very closely and looking at their debt very closely. There's a reason it's negative, and it's because you got too much debt. Same problem with the state of Louisiana. I don't care what anybody says. Louisiana has too much debt. Many of our towns and municipalities across the state have too much debt, and we're not doing a good enough job living within our means.
Will the Bond Commission look at our rating by these agencies and raise any questions about that?
Well, again, all the Bond Commission is doing is looking at some numbers, and so this is what I was going to say earlier. So they hire these financial assistants to come in, run all their numbers, look at their income, look at their expenses, and come up with formulas to decide whether a city can afford to borrow money.